Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 2, Episode 10. Today, we'll be discussing Stephen King, and to help me with that, we have our first ever panel interview on the show. I'm Alex Howe, and joining me are Dr. Simon Brown, a professor of film and television at Kingston University, and Dr. Regina Hansen, a master lecturer of rhetoric at Boston University, and also a young adult author. I reached out to Simon and Regina because in 2017, they co-edited a special issue of the journal Science Fiction, Film, and Television, celebrating Stephen King's 70th birthday. So I thought they would be the perfect choice to discuss his place in the world of science fiction. So, Simon, Regina, thank you both for coming on the show.
You're very welcome.
Now, for some background, just to explain to the audience where I'm coming from, I knew I wanted to do an episode about Stephen King as a major author in the history of sci-fi. But as I told you in our correspondence, I haven't actually read any of his books. And I think that's because while I'm a big sci-fi fan, I'm not so much into horror. I did read his short story, The Jaunt, and I think we read the first chapter of The Stand in high school for some kind of exercise, but that's it, besides seeing a few of the movies on TV. So to start off, why don't you talk about what drew each of you to Stephen King's work, especially in your professional scholarship?
Regina, do you want to go first?
Regina.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm English. What can I
and
tell
I know
you?
you know that too. So. Anyway, so I think you're thinking of the Queen having passed and everything. So I guess it was just for me as a question of childhood interest. Actually, it was because of horror. It wasn't because of sci-fi. So it was a childhood interest in horror and Poe and various sort of things like that. And sort of the stage, if you're a kid who likes that kind of thing, then the next step is usually Stephen King. And then so what happened with me is then as a scholar, I was a scholar of the fantastic in various different kinds of genres and sort of, took the chance when Simon invited me actually to work on this Stephen King project.
I came at it. I started reading. I came at Stephen King via horror. I came to Stephen King via John Carpenter actually, because in 1983 I was a fan of Carpenter's movies. We'd just got our first VCR, and I was watching all of his films. And then they announced that Christine was coming out. And it was an adaptation of this book by Stephen King. And there was no way I was going to see the movie because it was an 18 certificate movie. In the UK, if it's 18 certificate, you have to be 18 and over to see it. And I was 13. So I thought, hey, I could read the book instead. So I read the book and loved it. And then Pet Sematary came out a few months later. And then I was hooked, and I have been ever since. The idea of going into scholarship, there's two sides to this. It took me a long time to master the techniques of scholarships that I felt I needed to be able to write about something that I cared about so much. That was the first thing. So I was an early cinema scholar for many years, and then took a U-turn into Stephen King simply by virtue of the fact I finally felt I was ready to do it. But the science fiction aspect of it really came to me by starting watching Under the Dome, the TV series, and I was watching, this was in the first season when it looked like it might be good. One of those pieces that you write and then 5 years later you look back at it and go, yeah, no, it didn't quite work as well as I thought it was going to. But that's why I thought, okay, this is interesting because this is a science fiction story. Nobody's really doing this, and Gina was the very first person I thought of as like the person to collaborate on it. So that's how the project came about.
Were you asked to edit this special issue?
No, I went to the Journal of Science Fiction, Film and Television and proposed it to them.
Okay.
With the two of us as editors, and they said, "Yeah, that sounds great," because it really was a gap in Stephen King scholarship. There just really wasn't anything written about his contribution to science fiction. So it seemed like having popped into my head, it just seemed like the obvious thing to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I would just say it is interesting that it hadn't been done before because, King will even, say in numerous sort of interviews and sort of autobiographical writings that he's done, how he read science fiction like pulps when he was a kid. So even though he's known as a horror author, he's really worked in many genres, including just, plain old literary fiction. And this is something that Simon writes about in the introduction to the journal issue too, that King, in his reading, really started out reading a lot of sci-fi because that was what was available sort of on the magazine rack in the drugstore.
Just looking at his writing from a distance, that's kind of the vibe I get, especially through his early work, because I believe the first book he wrote was The Long Walk, and that is a futuristic dystopia that kind of prefigures the Hunger Games.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, his first published work was Carrie, or his first published novel was Carrie, which I believe normally shows up on the horror lists rather than the sci-fi lists, but leans a lot into the superhero supervillain tropes.
Yeah, and it sort of boils down to, in a way, I was thinking about this over the last few days, and it's kind of curious because it boils down to sort of the porous kind of outlying edges of what science fiction is. I mean, I was reading, I can't remember what I was reading, but somebody talking about Carrie as being a science fiction novel because it has telekinesis. My first thought was sort of coming to this from the point of view of science fiction was, flying saucers, as you say, kind of dystopian futures, apocalyptic wastelands, rather than this idea of, kind of superhero powers or extrasensory perception and things like that. And partly that's about your reading of what science fiction is, but also I think it's partly about what King himself is choosing, what kind of angle or aspect he's choosing to take to the material, I think. And Regina, do you agree?
Yeah, I do, and I think, and that would be a sort of a general thing too. I mean, because you can make a movie about space aliens. I mean, Alien is sci-fi, for instance, but I mean, it's at least equally horror. So you can take, just because something has scientific elements to it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to turn out to be sci-fi. It may turn out to be horror, and I think it really depends on what the story is about, not so much what sort of scientific element is in it or what sort of fantastical element is in it. So yeah, I definitely do agree with that.
And I've talked about this on the podcast before, the overlap between sci-fi and horror. In fact, way back at the beginning of season 1, I talked about Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was meant to be a quote unquote ghost story, but it uses what are now considered science fiction tropes. But the thing is, reanimating a corpse would have been considered an occult act at the time,
Sure.
Even if you used super science to do it.
Well, and it also depends, I think, on the way a film is made I mean, a lot of people, when they think about Frankenstein, they're really thinking about the movie.
Definitely.
Which doesn't come off at all. It comes off as a monster, quote unquote, as a monster movie. And I think Simon can speak to this, as having written so much about interpretations of King, filmic interpretations of King. But it seems like the same thing happens there too. It's what does the movie maker do with it to decide how do they decide whether it's sci-fi or horror?
I agree. Yeah, I agree absolutely. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching the remake / readaptation, depending on, well, that's another podcast, of Firestarter, which is another story about somebody with supernatural powers, right? And I mean, the remake is mostly disappointing, shall I say? But because it seems to be sort of riffing so much off of Stranger Things, and the kind of 11 character from Stranger Things, and it seems to be kind of addressing that very, very directly. The first film, the original film from '84, I would not class as something that has been approached as a piece of science fiction. The remake, yes, that does seem to be that, but I think that's, in a way, it's also it's probably more imported because of the fact that it's something, whereas the original Firestarter was one of the inspirations for Stranger Things, the remake is now inspired by Stranger Things, so it kind of imports that science fiction aspect from a different text. So it gets very, very complicated. It gets very, very murky and very, very messy.
Yeah.
In that regard. I mean, if you see the TV movie of Trucks, for instance, which is quite hard to come across now, and has got Timothy Busfield in it, and is again, unfortunately, mostly dreadful. But that is a science fiction story, whereas Maximum Overdrive, King's own adaptation of the tale, not science fiction at all.
And I wonder, this is something I was just thinking about right now, because I was sort of thinking about, while you were talking, I was thinking about It, which of course, we find out, spoiler alert, it is a space alien. But it's clearly, this is a horror. I mean, there's really, some people, when they talk about the film, they call it horror adventure. And it's a horror film. It's a horror movie. It's a horror book, and it turned into a horror TV series and two horror movies. And yet it's based on something that is sort of the core of science fiction, which is invaders from outer space. So one way to think of that is, maybe, this is just totally, because I do a lot with sort of what monsters we're interested in at different times in history. And so when we move from the sort of universal monsters, right, the outsider monsters like Frankenstein and things like that, after World War II, we moved into sort of these sci-fi monsters, right, giant ants and various kinds of invaders from outer space. But those were still at that time, and this would have been when King was writing, right, they would have been considered horror movies as much as science fiction movies, if not more. A lot of those sort of various, space invader type movies, they were the new kind of monsters, and they were sort of representing fear of, invasion from communists, all kinds of stuff like that. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a horror movie. So I wonder if it's just the distinction that we make, especially when a monster is involved, maybe wasn't that much of a distinction when this kind of genre, sort of, at least when it came in to become film.
That's a really interesting thought, actually. I hadn't really thought about that, because I was thinking about It, and of course, if you take out the origin story of It itself,
right,
there's no science fiction in it.
Nope, that's right.
It's a straightforward horror tale. But if you think about the fact that the novel was set in 1958, right, and obviously in Danse Macabre,
yeah,
King writes about this sort of origin story of his discovery of fear, which was watching, was it Earth versus the Flying Saucers?
I think so, yeah.
And then them turning up the house lights and saying that the Russians had put Sputnik into space. That conflation of horror and science fiction, right, is happening in his head at that moment, at a time when the science fiction and horror genres were completely conflated anyway, as you just said. Maybe that's one of the things, that ways in which we should approach this, something like an idea of It, for instance, which is that these distinctions, in a way, between horror and science fiction, outside of the kind of generic tropes, they don't quite matter so much. If you think of It from the perspective of a book set in 1958, written by somebody who in 1958 was watching Earth versus the Flying Saucers, you could just as easily describe it as a science fiction story as you could a horror story. It just depends on whether you look at it from the perspective of the origin story of the monster, or whether you look at it from the perspective of the impact of the monster on the characters.
Right. And then I wonder also, because I think of the huge King world, and so many characters, from Dick Halloran to, Father what's his name from Salem's Lot, and Dick Halloran's going to be in It, but then he's going to be in Shining, and then the priest ends up in the Dark Tower, and some of these people, and then tons of other characters, and of course Flag, right? And some of these characters appear in books that are more clearly science fiction, and some of them cross into books that are more clearly horror. And this is something I just thought of while you were talking. Yeah. Even that giant world with the map that you see on the website, that I always love to look at. Oh, where'd this happen? Those characters living in that universe are crossing genres all the time.
Mm-hmm. And of course, one of King's inspirations was H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft did a lot of the same things.
That's right.
He had characters shared between stories. Some of his stories are clearly sci-fi. Some of them are clearly fantasy horror. Although, for some reason, Lovecraft seems to end up on the sci-fi lists more than King does.
Yeah, and I think that's possibly a question of branding. everything King puts out is described as a horror story. And I mean, I've said this before elsewhere, but I think it was Peter Straub who also said it, is that, you know, he hasn't really written a horror novel since 2006. Not really. I mean, you look at The Institute, you look at the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, and maybe The Outside. Okay, I grant you that. But in terms of thinking back to stuff like Carrie and Cujo and The Shining, etc., etc., I mean, he really abandoned that kind of central focus on horror quite some time ago, and now, in a way, he's just become himself. A Stephen King book is a Stephen King book, which is a really lousy way of thinking about it from scholarship terms, but he's, you know, he's a hybrid genericist. If there, I think I may have made that up, but that's what he is.
Sure. I mean, so Fairy Tale is a fantasy novel, but it's also about, if you've read it yet, it's also sort of about multiverse, kind of, you know, various strands of time, and so it's kind of philosophical in its the way it looks at what kinds of ways we can live in and what kinds of world we live in, stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of that kind of, it seems like his science fiction has a more, in some ways, a more of a philosophical bent, sort of thinking more like quantum physics, that kind of stuff. And maybe that's why it's not always recognizable as science fiction, and why, and if there are horror elements in it, that's what we think it is.
And that's a good point about branding too. This is something I first noticed a while back when I was talking about children's science fiction, where branding is everything. You know, it's young adult novel, or it's a middle grade novel, or it's a reading level such and such. Well, in that case, it's more that schools are controlling half the market. But a lot of that's about branding. But the same is true of adult novels, because we have these boxes of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, even though they usually appear in the same section of the bookstore.
That's true. A lot of times it's in the same. Very rarely do you have a big enough bookstore where sci-fi is going to have its own shelf, and horror can be oftentimes almost given its own thing, so people don't make the mistake of picking up something that's horror. Because there's such a prejudice against horror, I think, really, for a lot of people. They'll just say right off the bat, I don't read it. And also a narrow understanding of what science fiction is, because, you know, if you read Ursula Le Guin writes science fiction, and it's nothing like what people used to think science fiction was supposed to be. Wrote science fiction, I should say.
There's a great little piece, again, I found in Danse Macabre, which
I love that book so much.
Oh, yeah, it's one of my go-tos. But he writes this. He says, the difference between science fiction and horror is a trap. Both are works of the imagination. Both try to create worlds which do not exist, cannot exist, or do not exist yet. Fair enough, you know.
Yeah.
There is a difference, of course, and this is what I love, but you can draw your own borderline. And if you try, you might find that it's a very squiggly border indeed. And I think this is where we're heading towards, is this idea of, to use King's wonderful term, this very squiggly border between science fiction and horror, but also as well science fiction and fantasy. I mean, you know, I'm an avid reader of the Dark Tower stories. I would not describe the Dark Tower stories as science fiction myself, personally. I would describe them as fantasy. But I mean, I haven't thought about that. I didn't think about this until I was preparing for the podcast. It was just a natural reaction. Okay, it's set in a Tolkien-esque, Sergio Leone kind of other world. It's fantasy. Job done. You know, it's right. Conan the Barbarian with a gunslinger.
So what's interesting is that things that we sometimes decide to call science fiction, if we're not looking at the sort of cast of characters like the space aliens and the rocket ships and all that kind of stuff like that, the other way we think of science fiction is more like sort of what Margaret Atwood called speculative, right? So there'll be like, you know, what's it going to be? What if this happened? What if, like The Stand, which is really pretty much horror, but it's based on a science fiction what if a disease went rampant and killed like 99% of the population. That's a science fiction what if, because it's based on medicine and epidemiology and things like that. And a lot of the horror that King writes is like that. It's based on some kind of scientific what if there were multiple universes? What if there were, that kind of thing? And what if a space alien came down and sort of went into a deep sleep after 20 years and kept waking up? Or they're all scientific what ifs that are speculative and philosophically speculative, but based in some kind of scientific thing to begin with. And then they just a lot of times for King they don't end up being they end up leaning on something else, either fantasy like Dark Tower or horror like it.
This I think is interesting where you're going with this, because in a way, this idea that he doesn't get talked about as a science fiction author, it boils down to the question of whether or not he's using these science fiction ideas as you're talking about there, right, for science fiction purposes. And by which I don't mean necessarily, as you say, it might lean in a different direction. But the point is whether or not he cares that he's using a science fiction trope. And at this stage, I'll return to Under the Dome, the novel rather than the TV series. But, here's a book where the premise, again, spoiler alert, is that this town of Chester's Mill is cut off from the rest of the world because mischievous space alien children have set this dome there as a kind of, like we would an ant farm, to kind of watch what people do. And it's incredibly perfunctory as an explanation as to what's actually happening. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because that is not what the book is about. That is the rationale for setting up the premise of the story, and the story itself is, what do all of these characters do when they're cut off from the rest of the world? It could be space aliens dropping a dome. It could be the storm of the century. It could be, anything. It doesn't really make a shred of difference.
It could be a magical intervention. It doesn't have to be, something that you can explain, so to speak.
Absolutely. So there we have an example of a novel with a very definite science fiction premise, where the whole notion of science fiction has absolutely nothing, really contributes nothing to the experience of reading the novel. It is merely a raison d'etre. It's just a device. I wonder, whether that's kind of a way to think about this, not in a negative way, not in the sense that he doesn't really care about these things, but in a sense of, this is the way in which he is using science fiction.
Like the Twilight Zone, like to serve man. There's space aliens, and they're all trying to, it's also kind of like trying to avert the apocalypse. But in the end, it's the horror story. Mm-hmm. They're all going to get eaten by these aliens, and as you were talking, it made me think. I think he works the way Serling does that way, using those kinds of premises. And
this actually reminds me of another author I talked about a while back, J.G. Ballard. Ballard wrote these stories. A lot of them were about natural disasters, but the actual story was about the psychological breakdown of the characters in these natural disasters.
That sounds right, yeah.
Yeah, I have a professor friend at my university who always teaches J.G. Ballard the week before Christmas, which I think is perfect place to do J.G. Ballard, really, the week before Christmas. But going back to King, you think just to kind of, in a way, to sort of prove my point, you look at The Mist. Now, The Mist has a science fiction premise. The Arrowhead Project creates a portal into another dimension through which all of these things fly. But again, what is the point of this? The point of that is so you can trap a bunch of interesting people in a supermarket and see what they do when they can't get out. So I guess, the question then becomes, if that's the way it's being used, should we talk about them? Is it okay to talk about them as science fiction, or is the science fiction premise too tangential, to the story? And Alex, you're the science fiction podcaster here. You tell me on that one.
Maybe that's a good segue to another topic I wanted to talk about, which is maybe another way you can measure this is, what has Stephen King's influence been on the genre? You mentioned Alien. I don't know much about the history of the film. Does Alien owe some inspiration to Stephen King, for example?
I've never read that it did.
Yeah, me neither.
Probably not, I wouldn't have thought. I think because Alien comes out in 1979.
Yeah, so that is pretty early in the process.
Yeah, the only movies that had come out prior to that would have been Carrie, and I think Salem's Lot would have been sort of about to come on around about that time. Probably not. And I think, I mean, if you sort of step back and say, okay, what are his kind of hardcore science fiction stories, novels, let's say?
Yeah.
You've got Under the Dome, you've got Dreamcatcher and the Tommyknockers. Regina, can you think of any?
Dreamcatcher was the one that was in my head.
Well, on that point, Worlds Without End, which is an aggregator of recommended sci-fi book lists, they have a number of different ways to search them, but the only Stephen King novel that regularly makes the top sci-fi lists is The Stand.
I guess, because one the other thing is are we being very narrow about sci-fi, right? And one of the things that people from various sort of marginalized or othered groups have been trying to open up what sci-fi means for a long time, away from sort of just hard science and into this idea of speculation and based on scientific principles. And so with that in mind, there's enough sci-fi in The Stand, because I mean, look at all the movies that we watched. Well, I watched. You're too young, I can tell looking at you, Alex. But but that Simon and I watched when we were kids that were clearly considered science fiction, like the Omega Man, which is based on Last Man on Earth, that has vampires in it, but it's a science fiction movie because it's post-apocalyptic, or Logan's Run, or all those kinds of movies that are thinking about the world if these various different kinds of things had happened, bad things had happened, sort of usually some kind of post-apocalyptic thing. And aside from zombie movies, which are pretty much clearly supposed to be horror, a lot of those kinds of movies, we think of them as science fiction movies. And so The Stand would fit in, if we think of it that way, The Stand certainly fits in there as science fiction. It becomes something else. But I certainly, I can see that, if we're looking at it in that broad way that includes the interests of everybody who's written a science fiction novel, which goes beyond space, if as we'd already talked about. But then, I don't know, I think Dreamcatcher definitely counts.
Yeah.
Also.
Can I step back to The Stand here for a minute, just thinking about what you were saying? Because The Stand is 78, and around about this time, I mean, there's a lot of the films you were talking about, but another film that springs to mind is Damnation Alley, which is a film that everybody forgets, with George Papard and Jan Michael Vincent, but is a post-apocalyptic narrative where everybody's died, but the nuclear war, I think it was this time. But also in the UK, around about this time, it may have been slightly later, maybe early 80s, you had this massive Judge Dredd story called The Cursed Earth, where they have to cross the United States, and the United States has been decimated by an apocalyptic into an apocalyptic wasteland. And I guess the thing about those stories is the trappings of the stories are also futuristic. So in Damnation Alley,
thank you for that word. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah.
They have this funky sort of space-aged RV that they travel across the country, and pretty much the same as The Cursed Earth. The thing about The Stand, and I think one of the things that makes it so different, and this ties into the Omega Man, I think, is apart from the apocalypse, the story there's nothing science fiction-y about the story once the apocalypse happens. These are ordinary people. Right. Stu works in a calculator factory. He's just an ordinary guy. And then you get this mystical element. If you're good, you go to Boulder. If you're bad, you go to Las Vegas. And then there's a kind of nuclear apocalyptic ending, but nobody has anything science fiction-y
going on,
carrying with them, if you see what I mean.
No, and it's fun. And I should also mention, when we talk about the Omega Man, of course, it's based on Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which seems much more horror-y, right? Is it enough for there to be an apocalypse? That's a really good question. Or how does that apocalypse happen? I think of Omega Man. I think of, like you said, The Stand. I always think of Invasion of the Body Snatchers too, which is apocalyptic, especially the one from the 70s.
Yes, yeah.
Because the one from the 50s seems more like a science fiction movie somehow than the one from the 70s, which is so much more interested in the sort of tragedy of these people losing their identity, and they pick this incredibly, like, it's San Francisco. Nothing else looks like San Francisco, and now it's just going to be nothing, So that seems more like almost like a tragic horror story. but they're the same basic story. So maybe it also depends on what again, what you lean on, what results are more important to you about this first event, this sort of apocalyptic event.
Which, of course, ties into Cell from 2006, where, in a way, that apocalyptic event is very much not so much science fiction, but technological sci-fi. This pulse that gets sent through the phone network and turns everyone into phone zombies with a hive mind. That's really interesting because that's a science fiction premise.
Very
and then,
much
of course,
so, yeah.
on top of that, you layer the idea of zombie. Hang on a minute. Suddenly you're in a different territory again. But the finale of Cell, where everyone's kind of in this place, sort of circling giant cell phone tower, if I seem to remember correctly. I mean, yeah, that's got to be science fiction.
Is it? And then I wonder, then, is it science fiction if there's no, like, if these people just reacted to what happened to them and no magical element was introduced, but everything else happened and all the horrible ways that people treated people happened, and there was a leaders of the good guys and leaders of the bad guys who just happened to end up in Las Vegas and Boulder, yes, Colorado. And, if those things happened without the introduction of the sort of demonic figure, I wonder if that would be enough. Is it because we introduce this sort of demonic figure, this magical element, is sort of religious? He calls it a story of dark Christianity, right? So is adding that, does that take away from its being a science fiction?
That's a really interesting question. I suppose, trying to circle back to the question Alec asked about an hour ago, what is his influence on the genre? I'd have to say, from my own idea, that it's minimal, because he's not writing necessarily in that genre, but what he's doing is he's using tropes of the sci-fi genre in interesting ways. So I guess the thing to do wouldn't be to say, what is his impact on science fiction literature or cinema, but what does he do with the ideas of science fiction, which can help us to think about those things in science fiction literature in different ways.
Right. So he's writing in a tradition, and he's using elements of a tradition. This is something that lots of people do. He honors these elements, and he talks about it all the time when he's doing his hard-boiled detective novels. He goes, "I'm going to honor this tradition of or whatever genre that he chooses to write in. He will talk about the fact that now I'm going to honor this part of all the various traditions that led me to become a writer." So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's more a question of writing in a tradition and honoring that tradition, and then using it the way he wants to use it.
Which brings us back to Dreamcatcher, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is in many ways arguably pure science fiction in the sense that it is an alien invasion story, but it's kind of not an alien invasion story. I mean, I'm sort of setting this up for you, really, Regina, because Dreamcatcher is very much your thing. So, what are your thoughts about it in relation to science fiction?
In a way, I always wondered if it reminds me. You talked about John Carpenter, so it actually reminds me of a kind of and that's what is The Thing. Again, it reminds me in many ways, and I'm sure it's meant to be a homage to The Thing, where these sort of aliens take over, the bodies of these men who are out camping, but there's that whole sort of character, the character with Down syndrome, and a sort of an ESP that they sort of lean on for, that they protect but also are kind of afraid of, right? Their protection of him leads to a terrible violent event early in the film when they're kids, and then they sort of have to carry that. All of that seems, even though it's not magical, it's like an ESP thing, it seems much more like horror. But I do think that in the way that it is as close to in the way that The Thing is sci-fi, in the way that even like They Live is sci-fi, where the aliens come in and take over your body, it seems very much like it counts. And also the aliens are going to, at that last part where they're trying to get to the Quabbin Reservoir to stop them from poisoning the water, that seems very Andromeda strain to me, very, very sci-fi to me. What I suggest is that there's a balance of elements in King's books, but probably in a lot of people's books, and that the balance in Dreamcatcher is towards a little bit more towards sci-fi than towards horror, even though there's all those other things going on. But yeah, my favorite book.
I mean, it's an interesting companion piece to the Tommyknockers, of course.
Sure.
Which he himself says, I believe he calls it a book that is not top drawer. But I like the Tommyknockers.
I like Dreamcatcher fine too. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, both have got really interesting things.
Right.
What's interesting is, to me, is drawing a little bit on what Wickham Clayton has written about kind of possession narratives. The possession narratives in Tommyknockers and Dreamcatcher, this idea of alien possession, they're very different. In Dreamcatcher, it's more visceral because obviously you've got Jonesy who is possessed by the alien, but that's sort of like a two minds in the same head. Right. But then you've also got the kind of physical aspects of the possession, which is very much horror based. The possession in Dreamcatcher is a physical entity which exits the body in a very, very disgusting way. Let's put it that way. Whereas in the Tommyknockers, yes, the characters, they kind of start to glow green and their teeth fall out. But the main manifestation of this possession is the fact that they start, creating crazy stuff like flying refrigerators and this increased kind of mental acuity. And to me, that seems a lot more sci-fi because it doesn't have that sort of gloppy, gory, kind of body horror-y sort of aspect to it that it does in Dreamcatcher. So, I mean, I would always say that in terms of the novels, probably the Tommyknockers is his sci-fi book. That's his. Carl Sagan is Ursula K. Le Guin is kind of hardcore science fiction story as much as he ever gets close to one, I suppose.
I think we're talking about two different kinds, because when I think of horror, for me, I always think of supernatural horror. So when I'm thinking of possession, I'm thinking of demonic possession, right? And so when I look at Dreamcatcher, I'm thinking, well, it's not the devil, something that's like a parasitic kind of organism. And so for me, that seems very like soft science, like biological, but still, to me, that seems much more sci-fi. And even though in the Tommyknockers, it's almost more like demonic possession, but it's scientifically based. So that's really cool to think about. There's these three different kinds of possession. Which ones would we call science fiction possession and which ones would we not call science fiction possession?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I'm approaching it from a different angle, which is, the kind of physicality of the Dreamcatcher possessions is more exorcist based to me. So it doesn't matter what's possessing them. It's more about how it manifests itself. So, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. We're thinking about the same things, but coming at it from totally different angles. But
well, I think it's because I have a friend who's a biologist, and he once did his name is Christopher Collum, and he did this fantastic presentation one time about how all these various alien creatures are based on different kinds of bugs or lizards, so I always have that in my mind, and I think that's why I'm thinking of it like biological science, But yeah, you're right. The Exorcist is gross and Dreamcatcher is gross. Could be all it is.
But it's also interesting that, if the Tommyknockers and to a certain extent Dreamcatcher and Under the Dome are his most kind of science fiction-y sort of novels, they're also three novels that people tend to sort of look at and go, yeah, they're not really all that. They never appear on a list of everyone's kind of top 10 Stephen King novels. And I wonder whether that's because they're science fiction and therefore they don't really fit into people's conception of what Stephen King is, or whether they are genuinely sort of weaker books, which I don't necessarily think they are.
People want a certain thing from the author, right? Although they're willing to accept, The Body and Shawshank and things like that.
True.
But for some reason not sci-fi. That could be true.
I wonder whether it's like, oh, I'm a horror fan, this is science fiction, I don't like it. Yeah. Or I'm a science fiction fan, this isn't science fiction.
I'll bet it's the second.
I don't like it.
Yeah. It's not what I want from science fiction.
Yeah, precisely. We haven't talked about the Langoliers either.
Oh, that's true. And that seems like science fiction-y to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it must be in the sense that a plane goes through a portal to the past, but instead of the past being like history, it's sort of the smoke, the wisps of that which has taken place, which is gradually being wound up. It's a really interesting idea.
It's very I mean, that's the thing, is a lot of his sci-fi, and if you read again Danse Macabre, you can see why he just adores Ray Bradbury, and a lot of his sci-fi, some of it seems very Lovecraftian, but a lot of it, I mean, that seems like a Bradbury kind of idea to me. A lot of his work, he will say absolutely, oh, that's based on this Bradbury book, and this is based on that Bradbury, and Bradbury's sci-fi is often very more interested in the ideas.
I'd agree with that. And I've not actually, sadly, I've not actually read a lot of Bradbury. I think I came to him too young, and it put me off. And I've never got around to picking him up again, probably because I've been reading too much Stephen King, I guess.
Well, you'll recognize things when you start reading him, which you will now. Tisk, tisk. Yeah.
I consider myself told. But it's kind of, the Langolese is kind of an interesting one. But again, it's about setting up a premise where a bunch of people are on a plane and they get thrown into the past, and then how do they operate? It's the same kind of character tropes. The hero, the kind of guy who goes off the rails or is trying to control everybody. Slightly different circumstances, but something like that. Bronson Pinchot in the TV miniseries, he just wants to get to his meeting and will not accept the premise of where he is. I suppose, if the idea is really to explore what people do in extreme circumstances, if those extreme circumstances are science fiction based or horror based, it doesn't really matter. And if that's the case, then maybe in a very real sense, we're wrong to talk about King primarily as a horror author, much in the same way that it's difficult to talk about him as a science fiction author. He writes about characters, and the monsters, whatever they are, they don't really matter that much. It's not about, when he uses vampires, it's not about exploring what a vampire is or kind of examining sort of vampire lore or pushing the boundaries of what vampires can be. It's like, what happens when vampires attack people? It's the people that matter.
Yeah, and I would say, Alex's original question, what, how has he affected sci-fi? And I'm really kind of thinking it's more his style of, I know exactly who all these people are, down to whether or not they like their mother-in-law and what candy they eat and what they're dreaming of and all this stuff, so that when something happens to them, I'm going to feel really, really bad. Putting it in a place that he knows and loves, and he's going to make us know and love it, so that when you go there, you're going to know, oh, that's Bangor, that's clearly Derry, I see what it is, That's actually something that he has given, I think, to genre in general. I think to horror, to sci-fi, well, whatever, and people like, the Duffer Brothers will say, we're setting this all up because, in part at least, because of Stephen King. We have these characters doing this particular thing, this kind of losers club of characters, and that comes from King. It seems to me that is his effect, his gift to other writers.
And then the other really notable thing about Stephen King is how many movies he's had made of his work. I've talked before, that there's a standard big three or big four in science fiction literature. That's Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, and depending who you ask, Ray Bradbury. But I argue there's also a big three in science fiction film, and that's Philip K. Dick, Michael Crichton, and Stephen King.
Interesting. Yeah. The interesting thing about King adaptations, King movies, is that I think they are invariably approached as either horror themselves or as something that exists in relation to the horror genre. So Dreamcatcher is a perfect case in point. Here's a movie that is directed by Lawrence Kasdan, not a horror director. Stars Damian Lewis, a guy from the Kevin Smith movies whose name I've forgotten, Thomas Jane, and somebody else, and Morgan Freeman.
Jason Lee is, yeah.
So it may or may not be a science fiction movie. It may or may not be a horror movie. But it's being packaged as something that's slightly different to all of those things anyway. It's being packaged as kind of like a mainstream, sort of better than a normal run of things kind of packaged product. You don't get Stephen King adaptations as science fiction per se, with a few exceptions, which would probably be The Mist, certainly, which is a great film and an absolutely hideous TV series, and Under the Dome, which is failed but interesting TV series which abandons King's premise entirely and creates layers an entirely new, very science fiction premise on top of it. But is he in the same kind of category as in terms of science fiction as Philip K. Dick?
Well, Philip K. Dick does more of what King is more about the what if, like Asimov is. You know what I mean? So maybe he's closer to Dick than any of the others that are mentioned. Well, I guess I would ask Alex, like, so when you're thinking of science fiction, what are you thinking about? Because we seem to be talking about two different kinds of science fiction, right? Hard science fiction and scientific science fiction of ideas. So when you're thinking about it, what are you thinking about?
I mean, my first thought is things like Star Trek, which are, well, Star Trek varies a lot in how hard sci-fi it is, but spaceships, aliens, that kind of thing. But one thing doing this podcast has taught me is how all of the boundaries of the genre are these squiggly lines. Yeah, and this is why maybe speculative fiction is a better title, because is alternate history science fiction? Are dystopias science fiction? Is apocalyptic science fiction?
Yeah, I mean, like when I was a kid, I loved the Planet of the Apes movies. When I was a kid, that's what I thought science fiction was, but the Planet of the Apes movies have all those same kind of the old Planet of the Apes movies. They have a lot of those speculative. They're mostly speculative. They have space travel, but they're mostly thinking about alternative history and things like that. But they incorporate all the things you just talked about, and I definitely see them as science fiction and not horror. But yeah, but King doesn't really. I think King doesn't really do things like that, or like Star Trek, which I love.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess the Tommyknockers is as close as King's ever going to get to Star Trek. However, just listening to you talk there, I realized that for myself, I'm actually operating on a fairly narrow kind of concept of what science fiction is. And if you open it up into the realms of speculative, there's a whole bunch of other things that at the very least may not be kind of science fiction from beginning to end, but are nevertheless kind of magpieing elements of science fiction. So From a Buick 8 is a car that opens a portal to another dimension. Then you've got Desperation and the Regulators, two novels that came out simultaneously, one under King's name, one under the Richard Bachman name, in which you have the same cast of characters, but telling different stories in parallel universes.
The Bachman books, Running Man, that seems like science fiction. And again, it is really funny because when I read some, they really do seem like things that your mother let you stay up to watch in the 70s. Those kinds of movies, that's what Running Man makes me think of a lot.
Yeah. And of course, 11/22/63 as well, time travel. But it suddenly occurred to me, because we're talking about Lovecraft here. I think somewhere in Danse Macabre or somewhere, King talks about the Twilight Zone kind of and the Outer Limits sort of giving his generation something other than Lovecraft. And I guess if you think of, if you start to think of this kind of fusion of Lovecraft and Earth versus the Flying Saucers and Sputnik, and then the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits, and then you're sort of starting to see this kind of collage approach that he has to all of these different genres. I think Michael Collins, the scholar Michael Collins, because he writes about Stephen King being horror in disguise.
That's cool.
Which is quite a lovely idea. It's kind of horror, but it's disguised as something else. Or you could argue equally that it's something else disguised as horror.
A lot of times it's tragedy disguised as horror and nostalgia disguised as horror and all these other,
Yeah, precisely. So it also could be science fiction. There's no reason why it can't be science fiction disguised as horror. Yeah, for sure.
All right. That's certainly a lot to think about. So to wrap up, my last question is, where would you recommend someone start with Stephen King, both with the books and the movies?
It depends. Okay, that's a lousy answer, but it sort of depends. It depends on how old you are, I think. My first experience was reading Christine when I was 13, and it was fine for me. I know there are canonical ones, and there are sort of, there's The Stand, there's Carrie, etc. My own personal thing, if I was going to recommend somebody to start, I would go with either Salem's Lot, which is the kind of quintessential Stephen King story in many ways, or just because I think it's just so great, Pet Sematary.
So I adore Salem's Lot. So you stole one, so I get two others. One is if you're a young person starting with King. My first King novel was actually Eyes of the Dragon, which is fantasy, but also introduces us to the universe that will expand into Dark Tower and It and The Stand, and it's kind of a good entryway to that big King universe. And the other, which we didn't talk about, which has a science fiction element to it, is Dead Zone.
Of course, God, yes, right, yeah,
Right?
absolutely, the Dead Zone, yeah, for sure.
And the film as well, the wonderful film, and the TV series is okay, but that though that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, the film certainly is breathtakingly good.
The Cronenberg film, oh, love it.
And timeless. The other one I'd say again, it depends on the age. If you were gonna if you wanted to be scared, if you wanted to kind of see Stephen King as horror and can get past a certain degree of creakiness, I think Toby Hooper's Salem's Lot is
Agreed.
still holds up. It still holds up.
Eyes in the Window, absolutely.
Yeah, and yes, it's got David Soul in it, and so yes, it's a little bit 70s in that regards and a little bit creaky. But when it pulls the stops out, and this is CBS in 1979, so it's not gory, it's not violent, it's creepy.
It also has Jeffrey Lewis in it.
Yes. If you've never seen anything Stephen King-y before and you want to get scared, but in a good way, in a safe way, I think Salem's Lot.
Yeah. Existential terror. Yeah, definitely.
For sure. And if you've read a bit of Stephen King, but don't know where to go next, and you know the story of The Shining or have seen the movie of The Shining, the best treat you can have for yourself is to read Dr. Sleep and then watch the movie.
True. Agreed with that.
They're both fabulous.
Yeah. Agreed.
And it sounds like the Dead Zone on the sci-fi side.
Yes, I'd say so.
Yeah.
I'd say so. Very speculative and definitely there's an entire the reasons why this person has this Dead Zone thing is because of is explained as scientific.
And actually, to circle all the way back to pretty much one of the first things you said, Alex, because very few people read the Long Walk.
Yep.
Yeah, Long Walk is a great little book. Really, it's tight and dark and dystopian, but it's got all of the cast, all of the characters are kids. Yeah, I mean, particularly for a kind of young adult reader, I'd say that's a pretty good entry point into King.
Yeah.
Too.
Okay. Well, Simon, Regina, thank you again. It's been fun.
Thanks for asking us.
Thank you for asking us.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available wherever you're listening to it right now, and also all the major platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. The next episode will air on Halloween, and we'll round out October with another interview. This past week, I interviewed Nick Nocturne, host of the YouTube channel Nightmind, to pick his brain about his favorite subject matter, the sci-fi and horror found footage of the internet, better known as unfiction. Thanks for listening.